Hi, this is Josh Kulp. We are learning Daf Shevui, Daf Kaf Heh of Masechet Kiddushin, page 25 Masechet Kiddushin. And I wanted to use this video to talk about two parts of this week's Daf. The first is the very beginning, which is really like a delicious, interesting story concerning the halacha that we're talking about a master who hits one of her strikes or injures one of his slaves and thereby causes an injury, a loss of a limb. Usually we don't get the sort of a setting in which the rabbis are discussing an issue, but here we get a very interesting setting, and I think it shows us a little bit about the values, at least the intellectual, discursive kind of Beit Midrash values of the rabbis in Babylonia. The story is that there were some elders, some chachamim, in a place called Nizonia, who didn't come to the study session of Rav Chisda, and Rav Hamnuna, who seems to be Rav Chisda's sort of henchman, is sent to either, according to one reading of this, excommunicate them, or according to another reading, to rebuke them. And he goes and he says to them, well, why didn't you come to this study session of Rav Chisda? And he says, why should we come? Because we asked Rav Chisda a question and he didn't answer it for us. And that seems to be the value that we get over here. We get it in the continuation of the story when he comes back to Rav Chisda, who knows actually how to answer the question. But you can see here what is valued. I want to say two things about it. One is the ability to answer questions, but we should be careful. This is not really a halachic question. I doubt that the rabbis of Nizunya are actually worried about a real case in which a master castrates a slave. Again, I can't prove that this didn't happen. We have no such stories of it, and I'm not really convinced that some of these laws were actually observed in the Talmudic period. But what does seem to be the issue over here is, can Rav Chisda or can a sage compare a halacha from one field of the Mishnah, one field of halacha, to another field? Rav Chisda ends up answering the question by going all the way to something related to negaim, to skin afflictions. Somebody who's well versed in, let's say, the laws of Bava Kama or the laws of Kiddushin, about injury and about slave acquisition and slaves going free, may not be so well versed in Negaim, the laws of skin afflictions. After all, that's kind of like an obscure part of the Mishnah. So Rav Chisda is familiar enough with Negaim to answer the question from there. But we can see here the value, what makes somebody a great Talmid Chacham, is the acumen and the combination of acumen and memory. He knows enough of other parts of the Mishnah, and he is sharp enough to compare one to another, even though the cases are totally unlike. The second issue I wanted to go over in this video, just to clarify something, is about how animals are acquired. The Mishnah is a little unsmooth, the Mishnah that begins on the bottom or the middle of Kaf Heh Amud Bet, a little unsmooth because it mentions three forms of acquisition: picking something up, drawing its reins, mesira, or meshicha, which is actually bringing it, physically bringing it. Now, there's a little bit of a dispute among Rishonim, the commentators, which is a greater form of acquisition, but the most Rishonim, not really Rashi, but most Rishonim think that Mesira is the least form of acquisition, because all you're doing is sort of picking up the reins, and you're not actually pulling the animal, leading the animal. You're just picking up the reins. It's almost like symbolic acquisition of the animal, and therefore it only acquires under limited circumstances. A stronger form of acquisition is meshicha, which is actually pulling the animal towards oneself, and sort of not necessarily bringing it into one's property, but demonstrating ownership by getting the animal to move through pulling on the reins, not just picking up the reins. And the greatest form of meshicha is that which is used for most objects, hagba'ah, actually picking it up. That is a greater form of kinyan acquisition because you're actually physically taking it into your possession. Of course, it's very impractical to do so, definitely with large animals, and the truth is it's also somewhat impractical with smaller animals. We'll talk a lot about acquisition as we go along. Most of these forms of acquisition require the presence of the acquirer, of the buyer, at the time of the transfer. In other words, I have to be there to take the sheep or the cow. And that is not all that convenient for a world that works on investments. If I'm living, let's say, in the south of Israel and I want to acquire partial ownership in a herd of sheep, in the northern part of Israel, I don't want to have to go there and pick up each individual sheep. I want to do it in some other way, and we'll talk about that as we go along. Obviously, sages in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, and also sages in medieval period had to find other ways that allowed people to acquire things without being physically present in front of the things. That's a major form of our acquisition. We acquire many things through remote transactions. So we'll talk about that a little bit as we go along. But here we're at the Mishnah, which is sort of the most basic forms of acquisition. Again, to remind yourselves, Masira, Mishicha, and Hagva'ah. As usual, I would encourage you to participate on our Daf Shevui Facebook page, where you can always ask questions.